When we look back at history, we find ourselves facing a lot of serious problems. One of those problems that we have no choice but to acknowledge is the fact that every single culture across this planet, for whatever reason, seems to have a history full of Earth-destroying cataclysms. This is a scientific fact. There is no way around the fact that we find ancient cultures all over this planet with these kinds of horrific stories. Now, the mainstream has decided to completely ignore all of this, right? It's unbelievable how historians can look at all these ancient cultures all over the planet, see that they all have Earth-destroying cataclysms, and then completely ignore it. They just move on, right? Oh no, our ancestors, they're just monkeys. They don't know what they're talking about. They're all crazy back in the day. Don't listen to them. They're all mythologies. It's all fake garbage. And that is the position of mainstream historians. This is the, okay. I'm already irritated and I'm not even like 3 minutes into this. All right, so anyway, when we use a tool like comparative mythology, it takes all of 2 seconds to notice that for some weird reason, all cultures across this planet share more or less identical kinds of stories. Now, I get it. You're probably also thinking, well, bro, they're not really all identical. A lot of them are similar or kind of the same, but then there are a lot of them that sound different. And you're right. You're absolutely correct. The other aspect of comparative mythology that historians never take into account is the fact that when our ancestors were recording these events, if we are going to assume that they are real, we have to remember that they all existed on different parts of the globe. So this would mean that necessarily their perspective in which they are recording the history is going to differ from somebody else's perspective that would be on the other side of the planet. So I get that, and I acknowledge that. But what's even more interesting about that fact is that we can use those varying perspectives to actually go ahead and prove that these catastrophes that affected the entire planet actually happened. Now, the point of saying any of this before we get into the main subject is to paint a picture that we have to take the catastrophes that we find within all of our ancestors' histories seriously. We don't have a choice. Just because the mainstream historian has decided to relegate all of these histories into a fictional, religious garbage ball or whatever that they throw in the trash can and ignore, that does not mean that that is the correct approach for everybody else. And in fact, it's not the correct approach for anybody technically, because the very second that we employ comparative mythology and we start to find that catastrophes are lining up across the board with respect to everybody's ancient histories, that's a huge problem. That's a legitimate issue. Of course, to make matters even more crazier, these events did not take place, 10 million years ago. These events were not going on a billion years ago. Our ancestors recorded these events, only a few thousand years ago at the latest. And the reality is, the last major cataclysm that happened was probably only 1,000-ish years or so ago. Could be a little sooner, could be a little later, but this is how close these catastrophes are to us nowadays. And these catastrophes, remember, these are not, little local, fires or a local flood. These catastrophes affected the entire planet. For example, when we find a culture back in the past talking about a time to where an Earth-destroying catastrophe literally wiped out their entire civilization, and then they also record other civilizations around them being wiped out, to a point to where there's essentially only a man and a woman left, these cultures are not necessarily exaggerating. They might be exaggerating a little bit. I get that. We can make a case for that and all that crap. But ultimately, what they're trying to get across is that this is how bad the catastrophe was. This is how destructive the event was, and the outcome was essentially almost total human annihilation. Now, to an average, historian, they don't believe any of this crap, right? They immediately throw all of this into the fiction pile, into the religious pile, and they move on. But is that the right thing to do? And I've already said it, but no, it's not. We can't do that. If it was one culture, if we had like one culture talking about all of this, right? We have one culture for whatever reason complaining about Venus being a comet or a flood story of some sort, right? If we had one culture talking about stuff like that, fine, right? Maybe you could look at that and you could be like, nah, they're crazy. What's wrong with these people? They're all, they're just smoking crack all day long, scratching themselves and living in caves, right? That's basically what mainstream historians think our ancestors were doing. And if that was the case, if we only found one culture with this story, we could maybe agree with mainstream historians nowadays. We could write it off. We could say, yeah, I guess they really didn't understand what was going on, and okay, fine, they're crazy and this is their story. The problem is that we can't do that. And the reason why is simple. There's just way too many cultures who corroborate one another with respect to these cataclysms. All right, you get that. But what's interesting is that this perspective actually brings up some other problems that we do have to find answers to. Now, we're going to focus on one particular problem in this show, and that is the problem of, well, if all of these catastrophes happened, only in the past few thousand years, and there were multiples of them. Remember, it's not that there was one event, right? There was not just one flood event. There were multiple flood events described, for example, and don't forget, each one of these flood events is triggered by a different catalyst, and the effects are different from other floods within people's stories. It's a very important distinction to make, in my opinion, because nowadays we find alternative researchers, especially mainstream doesn't care anymore. They've already walked by all of this and discarded it. So I guess I'm mainly focusing on the alternative people. But alternative researchers, what they've done, mainstream alternative researchers, I should say, what they've done is they look at all these stories and they agree that, yeah, there's similarities between all of them. But what they're missing is the chronology. What they're not doing is they are not looking and realizing that, like I said, for example, the flood situation, there are multiple kinds of flood stories, and each one of those stories is very distinct. Unfortunately, we find a situation now with the mainstream alternative researchers is that they are not looking at the chronological sequence of these events. Unfortunately, what we're starting to see in the alternative research community is these guys are lumping everything together. So if they see multiple flood stories within one culture, instead of spacing those flood stories out and looking at them for what they truly were, they're just combining everything together. So what happens is that, well, a few things obviously happens. The first thing is this is stupid because our ancestors are very, they're very clear when they say there was one mega flood back in the day, then there was some time passed, then there was another weird flood that happened later under different circumstances, and so on and so forth. The mainstream alternative researcher is no longer paying attention to that. And because they're not doing that, what is happening is that in the alternative research community, we are losing distinctions between events. And once we do that, we lose the chronological picture. And the chronological picture is the most important part of the whole thing. So if you are lumping in all of these flood stories into one mega ultra flood, people who do this are approaching history incorrectly. Our ancestors are very clear in a chronology of events that they recorded, that they survived through. So it's important that we respect the chronology that they wrote down. So that's a problem, right? If we're going to ignore the chronological sequence in a mythology, how can you take anything seriously if you are just going to smash everything together and then still sort of take the mainstream side and then just kind of, all right, I'm gonna get angry, okay? But anyway, you see my main point. Here's the main point. I'm getting to it eventually. Let's get to it now. Okay, so my point is that if you go ahead and you smash all of these catastrophes together, that means we lose a chain of events from then on. So if there are two very particular flood events, for example, and they are smashed together, what happens? Well, we immediately lose the truth. I mean, obviously we lose the truth because it would be like smashing World War I in with World War II simultaneously. I don't mean making the argument that, oh yeah, bro, World War I never ended. I get that. You can make that argument, and I'm not against that. But I'm not talking about that kind of a mushing together. What I'm talking about is if you were to take World War I and World War II and say they all happened within the exact same 4-year span. What happens to your picture of World War I and World War II? Right? You lose everything. You lose the entire reason and purpose of what's going on. You lose all the details. I mean, you lose everything, really. And what happens is that you would come out with a scrambled mess. And that is exactly what we are starting to see in the alternative side. And it's funny because the alternative side is starting to really acknowledge the catastrophes that are prevalent, all over the place, not only in mythology, but as we find more and more scientifically, we're starting to find no choice but to acknowledge the catastrophic effects that have probably taken place on Earth. So if you take, the actual physical evidence that we are discovering from the science, and then we apply that against the histories of our ancestors, the picture really does start to become a little more clear. Of course, the problem is that the vast majority of alternative researchers, they're still stuck with the majority of their mainstream psychological programming. For example, the theory of uniformitarianism, right? That theory is absolute trash. There's no reason to believe that whatsoever. But of course, in the Western world, everybody has been psychologically conditioned their entire lives, to believe that uniformitarianism is real. And this, of course, has carried over into the alternative research arena. So when an alternative researcher, they go to try to figure out what's going on in the past, and they come across all these ancient stories where the earth is being thrown around, you have floods, earthquakes, firestorms, oil raining down from the sky, blah, blah, all this crazy stuff is going on. It's very difficult even for an alternative researcher to truly look at this and believe it at face value for no other reason than that they have been conditioned since they were born to believe that none of that stuff is possible. And that's the only reason why. Now, people are starting to break that conditioning, and that's the good news. People are really starting to see the world for what it truly is. Now, we're only going to focus on the world of history and science right now, but this spills over into other aspects of society. And don't worry, I'm not playing holier than thou. I am still just as affected by the mainstream propaganda as anybody, right? The only difference is that at least I try to acknowledge the fact that I've been poisoned, and I'm trying to get out of it. Remember, admitting you have a problem is the first step to solving it. Anyway, because we find ourselves in a position to where the psychological conditioning is so prevalent, even in the alternative side, what's going on is that alternative researchers are taking these catastrophic mythologies now, and they're trying to look at them a little more seriously, but it still goes against a lot of their basic programming, so they don't want to believe that there may have been multiple catastrophic floods that affected the entire planet, for example. Or they don't want to believe that oil rained down from the sky, just like our ancestors report. All of this stuff to them, it's still too far out there. But by the same token, there's still too much physical evidence out there that exists that potentially really does substantiate a lot of the claims that our ancestors are making in their histories. So if, these people are generally trying to be good, so you can't just ignore all of the new scientific evidence that has been discovered that potentially proves at least maybe one of these catastrophes happened. And of course, this is where a lot of cognitive dissonance can also start to take place, right? I mean, like I said, the mainstream at this point in time is no longer a factor in any of these studies, right? They're long gone. But the alternative person is truly struggling with the evidence that they currently have at their feet. They have all of these ancient cultures describing all of these catastrophic events, and if you look at geological evidence objectively, you can actually start to match up a lot of the evidence that we find geologically, and you can connect that to our ancestors' histories. And this is pretty self-evident nowadays. So, if you're an objective researcher, you have no choice but to at least acknowledge that there is something to this. Now, the alternative person has the problem of they're trying to reconcile, all of the evidence that they're seeing with respect and against all of the psychological conditioning that they currently have programmed in them. And this is where the problem truly arises. To solve that problem for a lot of alternative researchers, they have lumped all of these catastrophes into one event. If they read about a culture talking about a flood or multiple floods, now all of those multiple flood events become one flood, and then that alternative researcher can now better psychologically handle that kind of a situation. It's not overwhelming to them because they can conceptualize perhaps one large flood, but multiple large floods? No. We can't do that. That's a little too much right now for the vast majority of alternative researchers. All right, why did I even talk about all this? I'm like off track. All right, I was supposed to talk about okay, I'm getting there. I am getting to the point eventually. Okay, let's get there now. My main point for talking about all of that was just to tell alternative researchers, do not be afraid to read the histories at face value and take them as such. Don't worry about it, right? Nobody cares. Nobody's gonna come over and start slapping you on the butt. I promise. Nobody's gonna come over and start choking you. You're fine. Take a second, look at the histories, and take them for what they are, and then apply the evidence to them, and blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's all that stuff. Now, here's where we come to the topic of the show 12,000 years later. Yes, my show operates on the theory of uniformity. We will eventually get there. So, let's do that. We are going to operate under the assumption that everything our ancestors talk about that happened with respect to any kind of catastrophic event actually took place. Now, this changes everything with respect to how we generally understand history. Because now when we're looking back 2,000 years, we're not just looking at civilizations kind of eating dust, kind of wandering around, sort of fighting each other, barely knowing what the wheel is. Suddenly, we find higher level civilizations constantly running around in terror from huge meteorites just absolutely obliterating huge parts of the land on Earth. We find everybody running around and reporting huge firestorms. We find continents sinking. We find other continents rising. And we find all kinds of civilizations being exterminated en masse all of the time back in the day. It's a completely different version of history, but it's a version of history that tends to line up with all of the geological and scientific archaeological evidence that we have been discovering over the past couple of 100 years. Now, here's the next problem when we deal with these catastrophes. We're willing to make the claim that, say only maybe 1,000 years ago was the last major cataclysm. And that last major cataclysm would have been responsible for the destruction of what we would have called ancient Greece, some of Rome, the Aztecs, all of these civilizations that were in a particular path of this comet that happened about 1,000 years ago or so. This is what took those civilizations out. So all of the mainstream people trying to figure out what happened to these areas, here's the answer. And it's and anyway, the evidence is there for it. 1,000 years is not that long ago. And if we keep rewinding the clock and we keep reading the histories, we find there's another cataclysm not too far away from that. And then a little further back, another one. And by further back, I mean just few hundred years, maybe 1,000 years in between each of these major cataclysms. And then, of course, in between a lot of these, major cataclysmic events, there's all of these little cataclysms going on that you could essentially consider aftershocks of the major ones. This is the picture that our ancestors are painting. Now, of course, there's one other major aspect to this painting that everybody talks about and that everybody has as a similar factor in their histories, and that is the fact that all of these cataclysms are born from cosmological events. Now, this is the keystone to understanding what our ancestors were talking about. One of the problems that we face when we look at these kind of cataclysmic descriptions that everybody has, the question immediately rises, where the hell did this come from? Right? How do you flood the entire planet? What do you mean there was a huge mountain of water rolling over an entire continent, right? Like, how do you do all this? How do you sink a continent? How do you raise a continent? What do you mean there's oil raining down from the sky? You know, all this crazy stuff. One of the reasons why it's so hard to believe, and I get it, is that we have no modern day analogy to any of this. Not only that, I mean, that's bad enough, but to make it even worse, the reality is when we look around and we try to think of a way to make these cataclysms happen with just what we see now on Earth, we don't really see any true process that could activate any of these kinds of events, at least not on those scales. Yeah, we get an earthquake. You can have some severe earthquakes, but an earthquake that's literally sinking a continent, you know, we've never seen that, right? Even though we have seen land masses sink in modern times, like we have seen islands sink. We have seen islands rise from the ocean bottom. But, you know, you can even push that aside because, you know, the way mainstream geology approaches everything. But at the end of the day, regardless, that's not a continent, right? And I give you that. We're not watching a continent sink. We're seeing a little volcano pop up from the water and then it collapses. Fine, whatever. But we do have precedents for these kinds of events happening, so it's not too far out there for anybody to take some of this stuff seriously, right? We know that there can be a fire tornado. We have videos of those. That can exist, for example. That's not science fiction. A huge hurricane that devastates a large area, that is not science fiction. We can look at a hurricane and be like, yeah, you could probably have a huge hurricane that might seem like the end of the world. But the problem is that our ancestors describe stuff like hurricanes not as a local horrific event, but as a worldwide catastrophic event. And that's the key difference. And of course, the problem is, where the hell does all this energy come from? How do you even get any of these events to start? We have no analogies for that nowadays, so it's really hard for your average person to take any of our ancestors' histories seriously, and I get that. But when we start to engage in comparative mythology, suddenly everything changes. Because the first thing that we immediately notice, and that I've already mentioned, is that most of the culture's stories are at least similar, if not exactly identical. Right? That's the first point of contention that we can't get away from. Okay, fine, but that's that. But what is possibly the one main factor that all of them share across the board, no matter what? Is there a factor that every single one of these histories records that matches up with every single other history? And the answer is yes, there is something there, and that is the cosmological factor. Of course, this will now bring us into the realm of the gods, so to speak. Because this is the main factor that everybody has in common, is that all the gods up in the sky are doing something. Right? Everybody talks about the gods in the sky doing things. And they also blame all of these catastrophes on the actions of said gods. Now, a mainstream person will immediately bow out here because now we're talking about gods, and they, of course, want nothing to do with religion, and they're gone. All right, so they're out of here. They're gone. A lot of alternative mainstream people, they will also leave as well, due to their, Western psychological conditioning that has ensured that they are militant atheists, and they will immediately discard anything with the word God or religion in it. So we lose a lot of those people immediately. Anybody who sticks around, of course, we're all kind of stuck, kind of wondering, all right, fine, we'll keep going with this, but what are the answers here? Now, of course, on this channel, what we do here is we replace the word God with planet, and suddenly everything makes sense. Because what's up in the sky, right? Space. What's in space? Planets. What were the planets to our ancestors? The gods. All right, great. So we just did a very quick critical thinking exercise to correlate what they meant when they said gods. They meant planets, and they meant them in the physical sense. If we are going to take what they recorded seriously, like I said we would in this particular show, then that means that these people, our ancestors, they were literally discussing what the planet Mars was doing. They were talking about what Venus was doing. They were tracking Saturn and Jupiter. They were really watching these guys, and they were describing what was happening. Once we take this approach, once we start to look at the histories literally verbatim. Remember, these guys are describing gods, but they didn't mean it in the sense of a personified dude with a beard and a cloak. This concept, by the way, is very much a modern day problem. You know, nobody back in the day had any problem understanding when somebody talked about Pallas Athene. They meant the planet Venus in the real sense, right? When they talked about Ares, they didn't mean some, warrior, mystical ghost guy up in the sky. No, they literally meant Mars. So when they say that Mars did something, that was supposed to be taken at face value. The fact that we do not do that anymore in today's day and age, this is a modern problem. It's just like nowadays if somebody decides to try to talk about and study giants, or the possibility that only a little bit ago larger humans actually existed, once again, just like all of our ancestors described. If you were to say that giants didn't exist like 500 years ago, you would have probably been laughed out of the room, because back then everybody was sure that those things existed. Now I get it, the mainstream mindset will immediately say, yeah, but our ancestors were stupid and religious. Of course they thought giants were real. But we have no reason to believe that whatsoever. It's entirely possible that they believed that giants were real because they were closer to a time to when they were quite literally real. You can even, it's funny, there's like Herodotus, for example. If you read Herodotus, there's a little section, I forget which part it's in, but he's describing what some dude found while he was digging in his backyard. And the dude says, yeah, I was digging and then I ran into this giant coffin and there was a giant in there. So I had to rebury it and then I had to dig around it. And the story goes on and it doesn't care about the giant. Like finding a giant in a coffin on his property was just an annoyance, right? That I always found that hilarious because what the dude was actually trying to find is the main point, whatever artifact he discovered. I forget the section and I'm sorry, but it just goes to illustrate the point and the fact that, when you go further back in time, people looked at all of this stuff completely differently. Anyway, I only say all of that just to put our current perspective into a perspective, right? We unfortunately nowadays, most people in the Western world believe that they are operating at an extraordinarily high level of intellectual capability and that they know everything and that any of the weird stuff that may have happened in the past, that all has to be fake because all of our ancestors were dirty, filthy cave people and they were too stupid and they did not understand anything. I have the internet. I know everything. Like that is literally how society is nowadays. Okay. Anyway, there's a nice little tangent for you. When our ancestors were describing the gods, they were literally just describing the planets. Okay, so if we take all of this seriously, if we just say, okay, fine, all of our histories, all of the stuff that our ancestors recorded is real, now what? What does this do for us? Because here's the problem, or here's a problem that can be brought up. If we have all these major cataclysms happening only a few thousand years ago, and there's multiples of them, it's not just one major cataclysm, why is it that nowadays we don't continue to see these kind of cataclysms? This is a legitimate question. Because if we look up at the night sky nowadays, your average person could probably not find Mars on a starry night, right? If I asked you to point out Saturn one night, the reality is 99.9% of this planet is not going to be able to point out Saturn without the aid of something, right? You're just not going to do it. And the reason why is because it's just a little pinprick of light. If you're not interested in astrology, why the hell would you know where Saturn is, right? Why the hell would you know where Venus is? Even more to the point, why the hell would you even care? I mean, they are just little points of light. There is not a single person today that has been worried that Saturn would, I don't know, explode or rain down water on them or something like that, right? Nobody worries about that. Nobody is worried about Venus impacting Earth. Like, that has never crossed anybody's mind today, yesterday, or a year ago. Like, nobody cares. It doesn't matter. And the reason why is because the things that our ancestors are talking about today are just little pinpricks of light that literally do not matter in day-to-day human society. But for whatever reason, back in the day, they did matter. All right, so if we follow this train of thought, that means necessarily that our solar system must have been in a completely different configuration. Now, of course, this is where a lot of people will also drop off, because most people cannot handle the possibility that the solar system that we are currently in was vastly different only a few thousand years ago. I mean, I guess there's the answer, right? I mean, this is the reason why we no longer see the kind of earth-destroying cataclysms that our ancestors record. Because the reality is, we have no reason to believe that our solar system in its current configuration was in this configuration only a few thousand years ago. That is pure supposition, by the way. So for anybody who, I get it, there's people out there that are like, but bro, all of the all of the astronomers, they all say, yeah, everything takes 10 billion years to happen. They all know for a fact that the Earth has been in this exact orbit forever. All the planets have been in their exact orbits. There's no way anything could have changed. And then, of course, you ask why. And the only thing that modern astronomers or scientists or whatever can come back to you with will be an appeal to authority. Because the reality is, none of these astronomers, none of these physicists or scientists or anything like that, nobody has any concrete proof that our current solar system's configuration has been around for as long as they say it has. Their position is pure supposition. And this is the ultimate weakness of the mainstream scientific and historic position. Did I just say position like 3 times in one sentence? Yeah, I think I did. Okay. Anyway, but so this is our train of thought. When we ask the question, why do we not see any more of these earth-destroying cataclysms like our ancestors did? The main answer is quite simple, and it's right in front of our face. And that is, the solar system that our ancestors witnessed is not the same one that we witness today. Now, I get it. I understand that initially sounds schizo, but the reality is, from a scientific perspective, and I mean a pure scientific perspective, that claim may not be inaccurate. And it certainly is not unscientific. This is probably one of the main points that we need to cover, because mainstream will immediately push aside anything that does not conform to whatever is currently being conditioned and propagandized within the mainstream zeitgeist, right? So us making the claim that the solar system could have potentially have been different just a few thousand years ago is immediately discarded by these guys, because it goes against everything that they've been taught, and it goes against the authority that they believe in. So we don't care about any of that garbage. We're going to immediately discard the mainstream because they're useless trash, and we do not need useless trash. And of course, when we look over to the mainstream alternative side of things, this is also going to be hard to swallow, because mainstream alternative researchers are stuck more or less in the same psychological programming. However, this postulate that the universe, or not the universe, but that our solar system may have been completely different just a few thousand years ago, there's nothing unscientific about this. So it really begs the question, why real quote-unquote scientists would cast aside a legitimate scientific possibility. This is how you know that the organizations that operate in the West are completely corrupt, and that these people are not interested whatsoever in discovering the truth. They are only interested in propagating their current belief system and making sure that everything else that is discovered falls underneath it. Now, most of you already know that, but if you didn't, there you go. I just shared a great secret of blah. Okay, you get it. Anyway, so when we suggest the possibility that the solar system was different, of course, you can ask the question, and you should, how the hell did that happen, right? Like, what do you mean the solar system was different? I mean, doesn't gravity, it's weak, yes, but things are kind of affected by it and over billions of years. I mean, how do you have a solar system the way our ancestors described, all chaotic, crazy, killing everybody constantly, everybody running around for meteorites, just getting slapped around by meteorites, these meteorites just smashing into people and chasing people around. They're chasing someone around Stonehenge. You're like, get away from me, meteorite! And they start going crazy. And then all of a sudden, blood starts coming out of the ground. You're like, what the fuck? Why is blood coming? Okay. Okay. What was I talking about? Science. Scientists are bad. Okay, so the solar system being in a completely different configuration is a possibility. But how did it get into its current configuration if it was different only a few thousand years ago? That would necessitate a very quick and strong acting force. Now, do we have a quick and strong acting force that may have been responsible for quickly, relatively speaking, quickly organizing the solar system into what we see today, from whatever configuration it was in only a few thousand years ago? And the answer is, once again, scientifically, yeah, we do. We have the electric force. The electric force, I'm so annoyed that I didn't see this 20 years ago. But the electric force literally solves all of our problems. Now, I'm not going to go into all of this stuff, but we do have a scientific reason behind how you could completely organize a solar system within a very short period of time. Once you employ the electric force, you're good to go, right? I mean, that's it. I don't know what else to tell people. The electric force is unbelievably strong. It makes gravity look like it is non-existent. And you can do experiments to prove this right now in your house. So don't take my word for it, right? You can go, there's all kinds of experiments right now that you can go watch, and you can witness how quickly the electric force acts upon objects and how quickly it can organize those objects. So when we look back at our ancestors' history and we start to take serious all the crazy stuff they're talking about, and we start to really look at how they describe the gods, or I should say planets, how they describe all the motions of these planets and the interaction of planets with one another, suddenly everything starts to make scientific sense once you inject the electromagnetic force. Once you do that, suddenly all of these planets doing all the crazy stuff that is described by our ancestors makes scientific sense. And there's no real way around this. Now, mainstream historians and cosmologists, they want nothing to do with this because, of course, this entirely breaks their entire career is essentially flushed down the toilet. But just because some, stuck-up dude in Harvard doesn't like it, that does not mean that it is not potentially real. We have several good pieces of evidence that support the claims for all of the catastrophes that our ancestors claim afflicted them. So with that in mind, we can now move on. So with that in mind, we can better answer the question of why we do not see the kinds of catastrophes that our ancestors did. And the answer is simple. Our solar system today is nothing like the solar system of the past. If we make that claim, and we can back that up by science, I'm not going to go, that's like 10 other shows, and I've already done that in some other shows anyways, but this claim is backed up by nothing but science, which is awesome, and then of course it's backed up by eyewitness testimony from our ancestors. Our ancestors were the ones that had to suffer through the solar system reorganizing itself into what we see today. The reason why you and I are not worried about huge planets smashing into us right now on a daily basis is because all of these planets have been secured. All of this stuff is locked down now due to electromagnetic principles, right? Nobody's worried about any of this stuff because the system that we exist in now has found its current lowest entropy. Once everything has found its lowest entropy, nobody's hitting each other anymore. Everybody's in their lane, right? Everybody's happy. Everybody's smoking joints. It's all good. You do crack, you chill, and you orbit around the sun. That's the solar system nowadays. Nobody's worried about any of these great catastrophes. Our ancestors were the ones that had to deal with all of that crazy stuff. We just happen to live in a time now that all of that stuff is done, gone, and it's not going to happen again. Or I should say that we are not going to suffer the kinds of catastrophes that our ancestors suffered simply because our current environment is absolutely different. Like the variables are all completely changed relative to what all of the people in the past had to deal with. Now, I get it, this brings up all kinds of problems, it brings up all kinds of questions, but the reality is, at the end of the day, the statement that I'm making is backed up by history and science. It doesn't matter if some professor at Harvard doesn't like this. It is irrelevant. This concept is based on scientific evidence, experimentation, and observation. And not only that, but it's also based on eyewitness testimony from our ancestors, right? We do a huge disrespect whenever we ignore whatever our ancestors tried to communicate down to us from back in the day. They were literally trying to tell us all this crazy stuff happened and to watch out for this stuff and to be prepared for it as best as you can. And instead of listening to our ancestors, we have instead completely ignored them. And now we think they're all crazy. But what if they're not crazy? What if all of these stories that were recorded were not stories, but are instead real histories? Anyway, so the answer to the question of why we no longer see or experience these kinds of catastrophes, or at least the kinds of catastrophes that were described in all of the histories, is a very simple one. The reality is our solar system today is simply completely different from what our ancestors saw back in the day. Now, does this mean that we will never see another catastrophe hit Earth? No, of course not. Who knows what's out there? This is actually another point that I find hilarious when people don't want to at least entertain the possibility that our solar system was different just a little bit ago, is that right now mainstream science has no problem saying that there are all kinds of crazy stuff going on out in space, right? They have no problem saying things like dark matter, dark energy, black holes, quasars. I mean, there are all kinds of potentially insane processes going on all around the universe. But for some weird reason, mainstream cosmologists believe that Earth and our solar system in general is completely immune to the entire universe. That's the most ridiculous thing you can imagine. Of course, it is entirely possible that Earth was struck by catastrophic events, cosmologically born, just a few thousand years ago, because we exist in space, and space is absolutely destructive, crazy, killing. There's no reason to believe that. Okay, all right, let's calm down. Okay. So you get my point, right? You see what I'm saying? I guess we've talked long enough. The point is that if our solar system is different now than what it was back in the day, then that means everything our ancestors are describing in their histories, that stuff could all potentially be real. So it's on us when we are reading these stories to make sure that we are looking at them from multiple angles. And one of those angles really does need to be from a position of a electrically driven cosmology. Once you start to look at all of this stuff through that lens, yeah, everything suddenly starts to make a lot more sense. All right, we've got the answer then. So if our solar system today was different from the way it was back then we have a lot of new answers that we can play with that can potentially shed light on a lot of the destructive and geological processes that we currently have evidence for here on Earth, and we no longer have to attribute them to stupid concepts like the theory of uniformity. We can just completely get rid of that garbage. And that's a plus, because once we can eliminate trash, that puts us on the road to truth, right? Okay, you get it. All right, I'm done. Yeah, we're done. You get it. That's the answer. Everything was different back in the day. Now we have a new solar system. Yeah.